detected.
Hey, Retro Rob back again for another episode of Coin Detected, where we dive into the history and legacy of 80s video arcade games and the people who built them. Visit coindetected.com to listen to the latest episode. Today's game is Centipede. Centipede. Just saying the name might conjure mental images of a bright, glowing swarm of mushrooms and a scuttling, multicolored bug snaking down the screen. This classic was released by Atari in the golden age of arcades, debuting in the year 1981, even though the game's attract mode splash screen cheekily says 1980. It's a fixed shooter set in a whimsical garden of giant mushrooms, crawling insects, and of course, the titular centipede. If you ever encountered a centipede cabinet back in the day, you'll remember it immediately. The vivid cabinet art with a gigantic green centipede and colorful mushrooms, the unique trackball controller at the center of the control panel, and the rapid-fire thump-thump of shots as players frantically tried to blast a relentless onslaught of bugs. Centipede was an instant hit in arcades and quickly became one of the era's most recognizable games. Now, one thing that makes Centipede particularly special is the team behind it. It was designed and programmed by Logg and Dona at Atari. Logg was already something of a legend at the company. This is the guy who helped create Asteroids and other hits, and he brought a ton of experience to the project. But Dona's role was groundbreaking. She was the only female game programmer at Atari at the time, and Centipede became the first major arcade game co-created by a woman. In an industry dominated by male developers, Centipede stands out as a pioneer in diversity, and it's often noted that the game's enormous popularity among women gamers was no coincidence. Bailey herself has gravitated toward an idea that she would enjoy playing. She famously explained that the concept she pitched was simple. A multi-segmented insect crawls onto the screen and is shot by the player. It didn't seem bad to shoot a bug, so that was the one I picked, she said. To her, blasting a creepy crawly was a lot more inviting than yet another war game or space battle. This approach, a fantasy forest of mushrooms and insects instead of warplanes or aliens, gave Centipede a more whimsical, less aggressively macho vibe than many contemporaries. And indeed, Centipede went on to be one of the first arcade games with a truly large female player base, on par with the likes of Pac-Man. Arcade operators in the early 80s noticed that everybody was crowding around Centipede machines, men and women alike, pumping in quarters. Let's talk about how Centipede came to life at Atari's California headquarters. The development kicked off around late 1980, with Logg and Dona teaming up under Atari's coin-op division. At the time, Bailey was a relatively new hire. She had a background in programming. She'd worked with microprocessors in the auto industry, among other things, and she specifically sought out Atari because she'd fallen in love with video games. Logg, by contrast, was already a proven game designer with hits under his belt. According to accounts, the project took about 10 months of hard work to complete. The budget for developing a single arcade game like this was surprisingly high for the time, on the order of $500,000. Atari was investing big to stay ahead in the booming arcade market, so the pressure was on to deliver something special. The initial concept of Centipede went through some evolution during development. Early on, the game's design was apparently more static, almost like a twist on Space Invaders. In fact, one prototype idea had mushrooms acting as indestructible barriers, similar to the shields in Space Invaders. Can you imagine? You would have had a phalanx of mushrooms that never budged, with the centipede weaving through like aliens descending. It would have been a very different game, maybe too predictable, too derivative. Logg realized that making the mushrooms destructible added a whole new dynamic element. This simple change meant the playfield could be altered by the player's actions and by the game's events. If you shoot a mushroom enough times, you clear it out. That lets skilled players clean up parts of the field, and it also made each wave unique. Dona also thought it was important to incorporate randomness. She didn't want the same exact pattern of mushrooms every level. So Centipede uses a random number generator to scatter the mushrooms differently each round. That ensured no two games were alike and kept players on their toes. These design tweaks, along with some other happy accidents in development, transformed Centipede from a straightforward shooter into something more unpredictable and alive. When you fire up the game, here's what you experience. You're in control of the Bug Blaster, which is basically a little insect-like or turret at the bottom of the screen. This is a fixed shooter, meaning you can move your Bug Blaster around only in a restricted area, specifically the lower portion of the screen, about the bottom fifth, but you can't scroll or leave the area. Your job is to shoot darts upward at the descending centipede and any other critters that appear. And instead of a joystick, Atari equipped Centipede with a hefty trackball for controls. If you've never played a trackball arcade game, imagine a small bowling ball or a smooth pool ball embedded in the console that you roll with your hand. That's how you move the Bug Blaster. The trackball in Centipede lets you zip your shooter around quickly and precisely in all directions. This was a brilliant choice. The feel of the game is very fluid and kinetic. In fact, Centipede was one of the earliest shooters to use a trackball. Atari had used trackballs in a few games before, like Missile Command, but applying it to a character shooter gave Centipede a distinctive, fast-paced feel. Skilled players can whip that Bug Blaster from one side of the screen to the other almost instantly, something a standard joystick couldn't match. Now, picture the playfield. The majority of the screen above you is a dark background populated by randomly scattered mushrooms, these little roundly colored fungi obstacles. The eponymous Centipede, a long chain of round segments, slithers in from the top screen. It moves horizontally, left to right or right to left, and whenever it hits either the screen edge or a mushroom in its path, it drops down one row and reverses direction. So as this creature zigzags downward, it's constantly bouncing off mushrooms and edging closer. Your darts will destroy segments of the centipede. If you shoot a middle segment, that segment turns mushroom. Poof, a new mushroom appears where it died. And the centipede splits at that point into two smaller centipedes. If you shoot the head segment, that segment becomes a mushroom, and the next segment in line becomes the new head, which then turns downward at the next opportunity. Ultimately, you're trying to obliterate every segment of the centipede. Once you destroy the last segment, that wave is over, but only for a moment, because a new centipede spawns from the top, and the whole process repeats, faster and usually more challenging. But the centipede itself isn't your only concern. Atari's designers created a veritable critter menagerie to make the game interesting. First, you've got spiders. These guys jump in from the sides of the screen, usually in the lower area where you're moving around. A spider moves in a kind of zigzag hopping pattern. It might bounce diagonally, then loop up and down erratically. They have a quirky, unpredictable movement, which means you can't just camp in one spot safely. A spider might leap right into you if you're not careful. Spiders are dangerous because if one touches your Bug Blaster, you lose a life. But they also are useful way. As they crawl around, they eat mushrooms, removing mushrooms wherever they bounce. That can clear out some obstacles for you or ruin a defensive mushroom setup you were working on. They also yield juicy points. The closer a spider is when you shoot it, the more points you get. A spider right next to you can be worth a whopping 900 points, which is huge compared to most targets. So, expert players sometimes take calculated risks, letting spiders come in close before blasting them to maximize their score. Next, there are fleas. These are nasty little guys that drop vertically straight down from the top of the screen, almost like dive bombers. They don't aim at you per se, they just plummet down at high speed. As they fall, fleas have a special role. If the lower part of the playfield is too empty of mushrooms, in other words, if you as the player have been diligently clearing mushrooms out, the game will send a flea to reseed the area. A flea will leave new mushrooms behind it as it falls, quickly cluttering up any open space. So you can't just clear all mushrooms and expect an easy time. The game actively fights back to keep your mushroom patch dense. To make it more challenging, fleas require 2 shots to kill. The first hit just enrages it, making it fall even faster, and the second hit finishes it off. If you fail to shoot a flea at all, it will drop all the way to the bottom and disappear after leaving a trail of fresh mushrooms in its wake, which means more obstacles for you and more chances for the centipede to zigzag unpredictably. So part of the strategy is don't ignore the fleas. You generally want to shoot them as soon as possible before they turn the battlefield into a dense mushroom forest again. By the way, as your score increases beyond certain thresholds, the fleas start falling even faster, making the game progressively more frantic. Now for the scorpion. Scorpions don't directly attack you, and they won't collide with you like spiders or centipedes do. Instead, they cruise horizontally across the screen, usually somewhere in the middle or top area. Scorpions have a devious function. Any mushroom they pass over gets poisoned. You can tell a poisoned mushroom because it changes color. A centipede touches a poisoned mushroom, it freaks out and plunges straight down toward the bottom of the screen instead of politely zigzagging back and forth. In essence, a poisoned mushroom sends the centipede head directly on a kamikaze run towards you. This can really catch a player off guard. One moment, the centipede is weaving slowly, and the next moment, after hitting a poisoned mushroom, it's in full dive bomb mode, dropping rapidly down the screen. The only way to stop a poisoned centipede from charging is to shoot its head, otherwise it will keep coming. Scorpions, fortunately, appear relatively less often, and only after you've progressed through a couple of waves. But when they do, you should prioritize taking them out. Not only do they prevent chaos by avoiding poisoned mushrooms, they're also worth a big 1,000 points each, making them the highest value target in the game. The catch is they move fast, so you often have just a brief chance to nail a scorpion as it zips by. Between the centipede that's increasingly splitting into multiple heads, the plummeting fleas planting new mushrooms, the erratic deadly spiders, and the scorpions threatening to poison your field, the game becomes a hectic juggling act. As you advance through waves, the difficulty ramps up nicely. The very first wave starts with a full centipede of one head and 11 body segments. Each subsequent wave introduces centipedes that might be shorter, but with multiple heads entering from different sides, until around the 12th wave, you're basically getting nothing but heads. A torrent of fast-moving head segments dropping down relentlessly. The game then cycles back to longer centipedes, but faster and more aggressive everything. Essentially, it's endless. It just keeps cycling and getting more challenging the longer you survive. There's no final boss, or it was all about chasing the high score, as was typical in that era. And chasing the high score was absolutely a thing people did passionately with Centipede. The game was a quarter cruncher for sure. It was so popular upon release that Atari and arcade operators could hardly keep up with demand. You'd walk into an arcade in late 91 or 82 and often see a Centipede machine with a small crowd. Someone playing intently, others quarter-upping, putting their coins on the bezel to reserve the next turn, and spectators marveling at the neon visual spectacle of the game. The visuals deserve praise. Atari used a 8-bit color raster graphics system. This wasn't a vector game like some earlier ones. The mushrooms are drawn in bright pastel colors, pinks, greens, blues, giving the game a uniquely cheerful look. In an era when many shooters had dark, spacey, or militaristic aesthetics, Centipede's glowing pastel mushroom garden really stood out. This aesthetic choice is often credited with helping draw in players who might not have been typical arcade rats. The whole tone is slightly playful and fairy tale-like, even as the gameplay itself gets extremely intense. There's a charming contrast in blasting creepy bugs into oblivion while cheerful colors pop on screen. From a technical perspective, Centipede ran on relatively modest hardware, even for its time. The arcade machine was powered by a MOS Technology 6502 microprocessor, running at roughly 1.5 MHz. The arcade machine was powered by a MOS Technology 6502 microprocessor era, an 8-bit workhorse. The sound and input were handled by an Atari custom chip known as the Pokey chip. Pokey was famous for generating audio tones and reading control inputs, and it even managed coin input and the random number generation. Memory was at a premium. The entire game program, graphics and sound, squeezed into just a few kilobytes of ROM. In fact, all of Centipede's code and data fit in on the order of only 12 kilobytes, an astoundingly small size by today's standards. But within those tight constraints, the developers were very clever. For example, there's a tiny bit of persistent memory, a special 64-byte EEPROM. that allowed Centipede cabinets to save the high score and player initials even after the power was turned off. That was a relatively new feature at the time, high score retention, so that the top score in the arcade stayed on the machine day after day until someone beat it. The code also cleverly handled a lot of on-screen objects for the hardware's capabilities. At its busiest, you could have dozens of mushroom sprites, multiple centipede heads and body segments, a spider or two, a flea, a scorpion. It was pushing the limits of what the hardware could juggle without slowing down or flickering. Atari's team did deep assembly language programming to optimize every cycle. They also had to integrate the trackball controls, which meant reading two optical rotary inputs for X and Y movement smoothly. And it does feel smooth. The result is gameplay that remains fluid even when the screen is chaotic. It's a testament to their programming skill that Centipede feels so responsive and frenetic with zero lag. One fascinating technical tidbit: the Centipede team anticipated that unscrupulous competitors might try to copy their game. In the early 80s, video game piracy wasn't just about software. It often involved entire bootleg circuit boards that cloned a game. And indeed, Centipede was successful enough that a bootleg arcade game called Magic Worm popped up, produced by a company in Italy, which was basically Centipede with some minor graphic swaps. The mushrooms were turned into apples, things like that. Atari took this very seriously and went to court to protect their hit. Here's where the clever part comes in. Logg and the programmers had actually hidden a sort of digital signature inside Centipede's code, specifically to catch bootleggers. They included a secret data pattern in the program that doesn't do anything in the game. It's never seen by players, never affects gameplay. It's essentially an invisible watermark. And get this, that pattern, when interpreted correctly, spells out copyright 1980 Atari in Morse code. It was buried so deep that the bootleggers had no idea it was there. They copied the code wholesale, and thus they copied the hidden Morse code message too. During the lawsuit, Atari was able to use this as smoking gun evidence that Magic Worm wasn't just inspired by Centipede, it was a literal code ripoff. How cool and kind of James Bond-like is that? The ploy worked. It gave Atari a strong case to shut down that piracy. So inside every genuine Centipede machine's ROM, if you knew how to look, there was a morsel of Morse code quietly defending Atari's copyright. That's a pretty legendary Easter egg, though one intended for lawyers more than for gamers. The developers also left a trace of a scrapped idea within the game's test mode. Earlier I mentioned the cabinet art features a big grasshopper that never actually appears in normal gameplay. Well, it turns out originally they toyed with including a grasshopper enemy type. That got removed, but not entirely. If an operator or technician enters the machine's test diagnostics mode and cycles through the sprite graphics, you will indeed see a little grasshopper sprite along with the centipede, spider, flea, etc. So the grasshopper lives on as a hidden leftover in the code. It never attacks in the actual game we play, but it's a neat footnote showing how ideas evolve during development. By June of 1981, Centipede was ready to hit the arcades. Atari marketed it strongly. There were flyers sent to arcade operators boasting of its appeal and earnings. And they were right. Centipede was a smash. The game sold around 46,000 upright arcade cabinets, plus several thousand more in cocktail table and cabaret, or upright, formats. To put that in perspective, at its peak, Atari was charging roughly $2,000 per machine to arcade operators. Centipede hardware sales alone grossed on the order of $90 million for Atari, which made it the company's second best-selling arcade game of all time. Asteroids was the only Atari title to top it in terms of cabinet units shipped. So Centipede was a financial powerhouse for the company. And, in the arcades, it was an earner. In the early 80s, Centipede consistently ranked near the top of monthly arcade earning charts. It often traded places with heavyweights like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Defender as one of the highest-grossing coin-ops on the floor. Arcade owners loved it because it attracted a broad demographic and kept people popping in quarters. Another aspect contributing to its popularity was word of mouth about how fun and addictive it was. Centipede is one of those easy-to-learn, hard-to-master games. Anyone could walk up and understand the basic idea in seconds. Move your bug blaster with the ball and shoot the bugs. The controls are intuitive, and there's only one fire button. Just hold it down, and it auto-fires rapid shots. The initial waves start not too overwhelming, so casual players get to enjoy it immediately. But then the game slowly introduces more chaos, and soon you're in a panic trying to survive. Yet because the rules are consistent and patterns can be learned, skilled players can develop techniques to push much further. It had a very high skill ceiling, and because it's a pure score-chasing game with no final level, it fed the competitive spirit of the time. People would strive to beat the local high score written on the machine's marquee or to put their initials at the top of the scoreboard. The arcade scoreboard keepers tracked Centipede scores nationally. In fact, Centipede became part of some notable competitive events. Atari even sponsored a big Centipede championship, the Atari $50,000 World Championships in early 1982, which drew players from all over, though, amusingly, that particular tournament was poorly organized and became kind of infamous among old-timers for its low turnout and logistical snafus. That, however, is a story for another day. Nonetheless, Centipede was solidified as a must-have machine in any serious arcade of the era, and it remained popular for years. As players got better and better, the scores skyrocketed. Extra lives are awarded by the game when you hit certain score milestones. The default setting gives you an extra bug blaster every 12,000 points. A really good player can earn enough extra lives to basically play for hours if they maintain concentration. There are documented cases of marathon sessions. The first officially recognized world record on Centipede was achieved by a gentleman named Jim Schneider, who in August of 1984 scored an astronomical 16,389,547 points on a single credit. Imagine that, over 16 million points. To give you a sense, an average casual player might score a few tens of thousands. Jim's marathon score was the result of several hours of continuous play, likely well over 5 or 6 hours of non-stop bug blasting. That was a world record that really cemented Centipede's place in competitive gaming at the time. It also demonstrated that the game, in theory, could be played indefinitely by a master, since it has no programmed kill screen or end. The only limit is human endurance and the increasing difficulty pushing you to eventually slip up. Over the years, other skilled players set records under different categories, like tournament settings with limited lives. But that first huge marathon score in 1984 is a legendary benchmark from the golden age of arcades. What separates the truly great Centipede players from the rest? High-level strategy in Centipede is all about field control and risk management. One key tactic is often called the mushroom corridor strategy. A savvy player can intentionally carve out narrow columns or pathways in the mushroom field by selectively destroying certain mushrooms. Why would you do that? To funnel the Centipede's approach. If you clear mushrooms in such a way that there's an obvious vertical path, the Centipede will more likely come straight down that channel, basically lining itself up to be a sitting duck when it enters your lower area. By shaping the battlefield, expert players can slow the game down a bit on their terms and take out Centipede segments methodically. Another tip: manage the flea spawns by keeping just enough mushrooms in your immediate area. Remember, fleas drop when the game thinks you need more mushrooms. If you always ensure, say, at least 5 or 6 mushrooms are intact in your lower region, the game won't trigger as many flea drops. This can buy you breathing room. Of course, as you score more, that threshold increases, and eventually fleas will come no matter what, but managing them early on helps a lot. And when fleas do drop, handle them quickly. If you let just a couple of fleas zoom through and pepper the bottom with mushrooms, you're going to have a much harder time in subsequent waves. So clearing mushrooms is a double-edged sword. Clear too many, and fleas swarm. Clear too few, and the Centipede has too many obstacles, which makes it descend unpredictably. Good players maintain a balance. Then there's spider handling. Novices often fall victim to spiders because they hop in unexpectedly and collide with you. A pro tip: spiders never reverse direction mid-course. A spider that enters from the right side will hop its way to the left and then exit. It won't suddenly turn around and come back right. So if one passes you, don't panic or chase it. Focus elsewhere, because that spider is effectively leaving. Knowing that, you can sometimes ignore a spider if it has already hopped past your shooter. Also, you can gauge when a spider's about to appear. They tend to come one at a time, and there's a short delay between appearances, so experienced players time the spider kills and even use their presence strategically. Some advanced players even intentionally leave one last centipede segment alive crawling at the bottom, because as long as a centipede segment remains in play, the game won't start a fully new wave with a fresh centipede. In that state, you can effectively sit in a kind of extended interim period where only spiders and occasional fleas spawn, letting you pick off spiders for big points without worrying about a new centipede wave coming. This is a high-risk tactic, but can be a way to maximize score once you've got the situation under control. It's sometimes called milking the spider for points. Scorpions are less frequent, but when one appears, it's almost always worth the attempt to destroy it immediately, not just for the 1,000 points, but to prevent it from poisoning a line of mushrooms. Poisoned mushrooms can quickly turn a relatively organized situation into pure chaos by causing centipede segments to drop straight into your lap. That said, sometimes advanced players use poisoned mushrooms to their advantage at lower levels, by letting a centipede drop straight down a column where they're ready to blast the whole thing quickly. But that's a pretty dangerous game to play once the speed ramps up. There are also some myths and rumored tricks swirling around centipede lore. One long-standing rumor in the classic gaming circles claims that a champion player, Eric Ginner, once found a glitch that basically made his bug blaster invincible, allowing him to play indefinitely. The story goes that he somehow maneuvered in such a way that no enemy could ever hit him. If that sounds too good to be true, it probably is. No concrete evidence of this glitch has ever been confirmed. It remains more of a fun legend than a reproducible exploit. It's possible it was an exaggeration or misunderstanding, but the tale persists as part of Centipede's mystique. As far as we know, there's no magic safe spot or pattern that guarantees safety forever. Eventually, the game's randomness and sheer speed will catch up with even the best player. Still, it's intriguing to imagine that maybe, hidden in the code or under extremely rare conditions, there could be a bug, no pun intended, that stops the bugs from killing you. Centipede also had its share of cultural impact beyond the arcade scores and earnings. It became something of a pop culture symbol of the early arcade era. The machine itself is frequently seen in movies from the time. If you watch the arcade scene in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, 1982, you'll spot a Centipede cabinet being played. It also pops up in the computer war movie War Games, 1983. Fittingly, since that film's about a young gamer hacker, it shows him playing Centipede at one point. Even James Bond brushes past a Centipede machine in Never Say Never Again, 1983, and it appears in other 80s films like Joysticks and later in bits of pop culture through the years. Seeing Centipede in those movies really underscores how ubiquitous arcade games were in that era's youth culture. If a director wanted to quickly establish, here's a fun arcade setting, throwing in a Centipede or Pac-Man in the background did the trick. Perhaps one of the most endearing pieces of Centipede's cultural legacy is that it inspired a song on a hit record. A novelty musical duo, Buckner and Garcia, released a famous album called Pac-Man Fever, 1982, which featured songs about popular video games. Alongside tracks like Do the Donkey Kong and Froggy's Lament for Frogger, there was a track titled Ode to a Centipede. Yes, Centipede had their very own cheesy pop song, complete with sound effects from the arcade game layered into the music. The lyrics humorously narrate a battle with the centipede and its insect pals. It's a real love letter, or perhaps a tongue-in-cheek serenade, to the game. The album actually charted on Billboard, believe it or not, which shows how mainstream arcade games had become at that moment. So Centipede wasn't just a game you played, it also had people dancing and singing along in arcades and roller rinks. The success of Centipede led to sequels and spin-offs. The very next year, 1982, Atari released Millipede, which was essentially the follow-up. Millipede took the Centipede formula and added even more variety, more types of insects, exploding DDT bombs, a larger playfield, and increased difficulty. It's a great game in its own right, though it didn't quite capture the broad popularity of Centipede. Perhaps it was a tad too hard for casual players, or maybe by '82 the arcade craze was hitting saturation. Millipede did well, but Centipede remained the more iconic of the two. Over the years, Centipede saw numerous home adaptations, from the Atari consoles and computers in the '80s, which helped bring the experience home, albeit without the trackball unless you had special controllers, to later appearances in classic arcade compilations on modern systems. But per the focus of our discussion, nothing quite beats the original arcade version with that smooth-rolling trackball and crisp raster monitor. Even decades later, the legacy of Centipede endures. In 2020, the game was officially inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame at the Strong National Museum of Play. This is a Hall of Fame that recognizes games with lasting influence, and Centipede absolutely earned that honor. The Hall of Fame noted how Centipede helped bring more female players into arcades and praised its enduring gameplay. Think about it. Over 40 years on, people still find Centipede challenging and fun. It holds up remarkably well. Modern gamers who stumble upon a Centipede cabinet often end up mesmerized by its simple yet frenetic action, proving that great game design is timeless. Collectors today still seek out Centipede machines for their game rooms, and fortunately, because so many were made, it's one of the more accessible classic cabinets to find. Original upright Centipede cabinets are not extremely rare. Thousands still survive, and you can often pick one up at a reasonable price compared to some rarer titles. The beautiful side art and iconic status make it a desirable piece. There are also smaller cabaret versions with a more compact form factor and smaller monitor, and cocktail table versions, the kind you play sitting down with the screen under glass. One quirky fact on the cocktail: Atari initially attempted a cocktail design with a larger 19-inch monitor to essentially give players a bigger view, but they only built about 25 units with that spec before reverting to the standard smaller 13-inch monitor for mass production. Those few large-screen cocktail Centipedes are incredibly rare now, coveted oddities for hardcore collectors. But any original Centipede in condition is a treasure, and not just as a showpiece. These machines are still a blast to play at parties and retro arcade events. Beyond official releases, Centipede's influence gained in countless clones and tributes. Many a budding programmer in the early '80s tried to make their own Centipede-like game for home computers, often with punny names like Caterpillar or Mushroom Alley. The concept of a segmented enemy that breaks apart was borrowed by other titles. Even in modern indie games, you'll sometimes find nods to Centipede's mechanics. And of course, the game makes cameo appearances in nostalgia-centric media. In the 2010s, the film Pixels famously had giant pixelated Centipede segments attacking cities as a homage to the game, and a recent episode of the series Stranger Things showed kids battling its Centipede in an arcade, underscoring its emblematic status of the arcade boom. It's also worth noting the significance of Centipede in game development history. Dona Bailey's involvement in designing such a huge hit was an inspiration to many. She became an icon for women in the gaming industry, often speaking about her experiences. At the time, her presence and the game's success challenged some stereotypes. It was proof that female gamers and developers were not just a minor footnote in arcade culture, but could be driving forces. And internally, at Atari, Centipede's success validated taking creative risks on themes that weren't just space shooters or sports games. To wrap up the gameplay side, I want to emphasize what made Centipede so fun and why it's still fun. It strikes a perfect balance between chaos and control. The trackball gives you a tangible, responsive connection to the action. There's something satisfying about the weight and momentum of rolling that ball, almost like you're physically pushing your on-screen avatar around. The enemy behaviors are straightforward individually. The Centipede moves in a pattern, the spider hops, etc. But when all these elements combine, the emergent gameplay is delightfully frantic. Yet it never feels unfair. As hectic as Centipede gets, A skilled player always has some way to wriggle out of a tight spot, or squeak past a spider, or quickly carve a path through the mushrooms. It's a game of both strategy and reflexes. You need the fast twitch reactions to flick the trackball and fire at an approaching threat, but you also need planning to manage the mushroom field and anticipate where the next danger is coming from. That dual demand keeps your brain fully engaged. It can induce that flow state where you and the game are in sync, your hands moving reflexively, your mind a few steps ahead plotting out escape routes or thinking, okay, clear those 2 mushrooms, then nail the scorpion, watch out for the spider coming from the right. It's exhilarating. No wonder that players kept coming back, determined to break their high score, last just one wave further. Centipede is high adrenaline, high reward gaming. Even the audio contributes to the fun. The sounds are simple but iconic. The Centipede emits a kind of rhythmic electronic chirp as it moves, almost like a heartbeat that speeds up as more segments enter the lower area. The spider has a distinctive galloping noise, and there's that satisfying zap when you vaporize a segment, or the crunchy thud of destroying a mushroom. All of it forms a sort of symphony of arcade action that old-school gamers remember fondly. Over 4 decades have passed since Centipede first crawled into arcades, and it's still crawling strong in our collective memory. It stands as a shining example of early game design elegance, a trailblazer in broadening the gaming audience, and a reminder of the creativity buzzing at Atari during the arcade golden age. If you've never played it, find a way to give it a go, maybe on a classic machine or a faithful emulation with a trackball, and you'll quickly see why it became such a phenomenon. And that's it for this episode of Coin Detected. If you have questions or comments, would like to hear me talk about a game I haven't covered yet, or would like to correct something I said, you can send a message to rob@coindetected.com. This is Retro Rob. This episode is over, but the game never ends. See you at the arcade.
The sequence is complete. Game over.